The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting long, uneven shadows across the small living room. The storm outside had knocked out the power an hour ago, and the house creaked under the wind's weight. It was the kind of night that made stories cling to you, like smoke in your lungs. "Dad?" I asked, breaking the silence. He sat across from me in his recliner, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Hmm?" he replied, his eyes fixed on the glowing remnants of the fire. "You ever heard any of those old-town stories? Like the ones people don't like to talk about?" His gaze shifted to me, his brow furrowed like he was deciding whether to answer. He took a slow sip before setting the glass on the side table. "Rookwood," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "What about it?" I asked, leaning forward. "Not what. Who?" he replied, rubbing a hand over his face. "And where? And everything about that damn place." He leaned back in his chair, the light catching on the deep lines of his face. "You've got to promise me, son. You'll never go there. Not even out of curiosity." "Why? What happened there?" He stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "It's a long story," he said. "But if you're serious about hearing it, fine. You need to understand why people avoid Rookwood, why even the birds won't fly near it anymore." Rookwood, as he explained, was a town about 20 miles west of here. It wasn't much now, a scattering of houses, a single street with a few boarded-up shops, and the skeleton of an old mill looming over the whole place like a ghost. "The Rookwood Mill was everything to that town," Dad began. "Built in the late 1800s by a man named Thomas Rourke. Big-shot businessman, rich as sin. He brought jobs, money, and a hell of a lot of pride to the town. For a while it was a thriving little place. But then..." Dad paused, picking up his glass again. "Then, the Rourke family disappeared. It happened in 1924, he told me. One day the Rourkes were there, running the mill and throwing fancy parties in their mansion on the hill. The next, they were gone. No warning, no explanation. The house was left just as it was," Dad said. "Food on the table, lights still burning. It was like they just stepped out for a minute and never came back. Naturally, the town panicked. At first, people thought it was a robbery gone wrong or some kind of foul play, but nothing was stolen, and there were no signs of struggle. After a while, folks started making up their own explanations," Dad said. "Some said they'd run off, that maybe they'd been in debt or caught up in some shady business. Others swore it was a curse, that the land the mill was built on was bad from the start." Dad was 17 the summer he and his friends first went to Rookwood. He rattled off their names like he was reciting a prayer. Will, Johnny, Clara, Sarah. "We were all bored out of our minds that summer," he said, "looking for something to do. It was Clara who brought up the mill one night. They were sitting around a bonfire by the lake, the kind of night where everything feels possible. 'You know what we should do?' she said, her eyes bright with mischief. 'We should go to Rookwood.' Johnny laughed. 'What, to see the spooky old mill? Big deal.' 'No, I mean go inside the mill,' Clara said, her grin daring them to back down. They biked out there the following weekend, the sun blazing down on the cracked pavement. From a distance, the mill looked almost picturesque, its weathered stone walls framed by overgrown trees. But up close it was different. It felt wrong, Dad said, his voice dropping. Like the air was thicker there, harder to breathe. They climbed the rusted fence and poked around the property, laughing at their own nerves. The old water wheel was still intact, though coated in moss and rust. The windows were smashed, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. "We didn't go in that day," Dad said. "We told ourselves it was just because we didn't have flashlights, but really, we were scared. Even Johnny wouldn't admit it, but you could see it in his eyes." The second trip happened a week later, this time in the evening. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the property. They brought flashlights and snacks, planning to stay for a while. Inside, it was worse than I'd imagined, Dad said. Dark, damp, and cold, even though it was still summer. The air smelled like mildew and something else. Something sour. They wandered through the main floor, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The machinery was still there, massive gears and belts frozen in time. It looked like the workers had just up and left one day, Dad said. Tools scattered, ledgers still open on the foreman's desk. The deeper they ventured into the mill, the quieter they became. It wasn't just the darkness or the strange chill in the air, it was the silence. No wind, no creaking beams, no distant sounds of wildlife. Just the shuffle of their footsteps and the occasional hiss of a flashlight's dying beam. Clara was the one who found the staircase, Dad said. It led down into the basement. She shined her light down there, and I swear, it felt like the darkness swallowed it up. Johnny made a show of going first, laughing to mask his nerves. "What's the big deal? It's just an old mill," he said, but his voice wavered. The basement was worse than the upper floors. The walls were damp and the air was stifling, heavy with the smell of mold. Their flashlight beams flickered over rows of old barrels and crates, most of them rotted through. "It didn't make sense," Dad said. "Why keep a basement full of supplies if you're just going to leave?" But it wasn't the barrels that caught their attention. It was the door. At the far end of the basement was a steel door, bolted shut with a rusted padlock. The kids gathered around it, their flashlights casting strange shadows across the metal. "What do you think's in there?" Sarah whispered. "Probably just more junk," Johnny said, but he didn't sound convinced. Clara knelt in front of the lock, fiddling with it. "We need bolt cutters," she said. "Or we could just not open it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Come on," Clara said, standing up and brushing off her knees. "We didn't come all this way to chicken out now." Dad said they left that night with a plan. They'd come back with tools to break the lock. He remembered how quiet the ride home was, each of them lost in their thoughts. "I think we all felt it," he said, "like we'd crossed some kind of line." It took a few days to gather the nerve to go back. This time they brought a crowbar and a heavy hammer borrowed from Johnny's dad. The storm clouds had rolled in by the time they reached the mill, the first drops of rain splattering against the cracked pavement. They hurried inside, the sound of thunder echoing through the empty space. "We should leave," Sarah said, clutching her flashlight tightly. "This feels bad." "No one's forcing you to stay," Clara shot back, already heading for the basement. Dad hesitated, but he followed. He could hear the others behind him, their footsteps hesitant. When they reached the locked door, Johnny didn't waste any time. He swung the hammer against the padlock, the clang of metal on metal reverberating through the basement. "It only took a few hits," Dad said, and then the door swung open. Inside was a small windowless room lined with shelves. The air was stale, and their flashlights revealed a scattering of old papers, jars, and something that looked like dried herbs. "It was like a storage room," Dad said. "But for what? I couldn't tell you." Clara picked up one of the jars, holding it up to the light. "What is this stuff?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. Johnny rifled through the papers, muttering about how none of it made sense. They were covered in strange symbols and diagrams, along with notes written in a neat looping script. "It wasn't English," Dad said. "At least not any kind I'd ever seen." Sarah stayed by the door, her flashlight shaking. "We shouldn't be here," she said again. It was Clara who found the trapdoor. It was hidden beneath a rotting rug in the corner of the room, the wood around it warped with age. "No way," Johnny said, stepping back as she pulled the rug aside. Clara grinned. "This is it," she said. "This is what they were hiding." The trapdoor creaked as they pried it open, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading down into pitch blackness. "Absolutely not," Sarah said, backing away. "I'm done. I'm leaving." But Clara was already heading down, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Johnny followed, muttering something about how this was going to make a great story. Dad hesitated at the top of the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to go, but he didn't want to be the one who stayed behind either. The stairs ended in a low-ceilinged chamber. the walls carved from the same rough stone as the mill. In the center of the room was a large, circular pit, its edges lined with crumbling bricks. "What the hell is this?" Johnny whispered, his voice echoing in the silence. Clara approached the pit, shining her flashlight down into the darkness. "It's deep," she said. "I can't see the bottom." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the place pressing down on them. "I don't like this," Dad said finally. "Let's go." But Clara wasn't listening. She was leaning over the edge of the pit, her flashlight beam flickering. "There's something down there," she said. They argued about it, of course. Sarah refused to go any further, and Dad was on the verge of leaving too. But Clara was determined. "There's a ladder," she said, pointing to the rusted rungs bolted to the side of the pit. "You're insane," Johnny said, but he didn't stop her. Dad described watching her climb down, her flashlight growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. "Clara?" Johnny called after a few minutes. No response. "Clara, this isn't funny," he shouted, his voice cracking. They never found her. Dad didn't go into detail about what happened next, but he said they searched for hours, calling her name until their voices were hoarse. "We never told anyone the truth," he said. "When we got back to town, we told everyone she'd fallen and hit her head, that the current in the creek must have taken her away." He stared into the fire for a long moment, his face drawn. "But we knew. We knew she never came out of that pit." Dad looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. "That's why you stay away from Rookwood," he said. "There are some places you just don't mess with. Some things you're not meant to find." The fire crackled softly, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind howling outside. "I'll never go there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Good," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Because if you do, you might not come back." Dad shifted in his chair, his face pale as the fire cast flickering shadows over his expression. Even after we left Rookwood, it never really left us. The guilt, the fear, it clung to us like smoke you can't wash off. Johnny, Sarah, and Dad, then just a scared boy, returned to town that night shaken, dirty, and half mad with panic. They agreed to stick to their story, that Clara had slipped, fallen, and been swept away by the rushing creek. It was believable enough, but it didn't sit well with anyone in Rookwood. "People whispered," Dad said, staring into the flames. "They asked why we'd even been at the mill, why we hadn't come back for help sooner. No one outright accused us of anything, but we could feel the judgment. And I think some of them knew we were lying. The local sheriff had led a small search party, but they turned up nothing. No trace of Clara. Not in the creek, not near the mill, not anywhere. The sheriff gave up after a week, but Rookwood didn't. You don't just lose a girl in a town that small without people talking about it for decades." Dad leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Johnny took it the hardest. He never forgave himself for letting her climb down there alone. Said he should have gone after her, but he was too scared. After a while, he stopped coming around altogether. Johnny moved away not long after graduation, cutting all ties with the town and everyone in it. No one heard from him again, though Dad sometimes wondered if Johnny ever had nightmares about that pit, like he did. "And Sarah?" I asked. "She went the other way. Clung to church, to community, to anything that made her feel safe. But even then, she was different after that night. Jumpier. She wouldn't even talk about the mill, not even to me." Dad paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But me, I couldn't stay away." The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. "It wasn't like I wanted to go back," he said. "But something about that place, it got into my head. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, dreaming about that pit, about Clara's flashlight disappearing into the dark. And one night, I did go back." I stared at him, my heart thudding. "What happened?" "It was a couple years later," Dad said. "I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease. Maybe I'd find something, a clue we missed. Maybe I'd just prove to myself it was all in my head." He described sneaking out of the house, driving the 10 miles to the edge of town, and walking the rest of the way to the mill in the dead of night. "It was worse than I remembered," he said. "The way the walls seemed to lean in, the silence pressing down on me. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to see it." The basement was unchanged, the door still hanging open. The trapdoor, too, was where they'd left it, the ladder descending into darkness. "I didn't want to go down," he said. "But it was like something was pulling me. Like if I didn't, I'd regret it forever." What lies beneath? The ladder groaned under his weight as he descended. His flashlight flickered, but he kept going, one rung at a time, until his feet hit solid ground. "It was a tunnel," he said. "Narrow and low with walls carved out of stone. It smelled like damp earth and something foul. Something I can't describe." He walked for what felt like miles, the beam of his flashlight barely piercing the darkness ahead. The air grew colder, heavier, the deeper he went. "And then I found it," he said, his voice shaking. "A room. Bigger than the one upstairs, but empty. Just bare walls and that same circle of bricks in the center." "What did you do?" I asked, barely breathing. "I didn't get any closer," he said. "I couldn't. I felt like if I stepped into that room, I wouldn't come back." He left that night, swearing he'd never go back, and he didn't, at least, not physically. "But in my dreams," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "I'm always back there, standing at the edge of that pit, staring into the dark." He rubbed his hands together, his eyes far away. "I don't know what happened to Clara, not really. But sometimes, I think about what would have happened if I'd gone down there after her. And sometimes I'm glad I didn't." We sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between us. "What are you trying to tell me?" I asked finally. He looked at me, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite name. "Just that some places aren't meant to be explored," he said. "And some secrets aren't worth uncovering,